nataka kujua kuhusu hali ya hewa ili niweze kukimu jamii yangu. Mimi nataka kufahamu ili niweze kufanya maamuzi bora. I want to know about weather information. So I make better decisions. I want to know about weather information. So I make our future decision.
Hi everyone, welcome to the FCFA journalist training. It's lovely to have you all here today. I'm just checking to see that we have most of our participants here. Okay, looks like we have most people here. Yeah, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the second Future Climate for Africa online journalist training. I'm Beth, the Knowledge Manager at Future Climate for Africa, or FCFA. And it's great to see you here all today, even though it's via a computer screen. So FCFA is really excited to host this journalist training. And first, I'd like to give thanks to our donors, so the UK government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and also to the UK's Natural Environment Research Council. I'd also like to give thanks to all our speakers who will be presenting and facilitating various aspects of this training. There was such a strong interest in the training. We had over 200 journalists from across Africa applying. So well done on being the second cohort of 15 journalists selected, and it's great to have you all here. Next slide, please. So for those who don't know, FCFA is a climate research program that aims to generate new climate science and ensure that this science has an impact on human development. It's implemented by 5 research teams, and on that map of Africa, you can see the different regions they all work in. So the yellow region highlights Fractal, who works in 9 Southern African cities, mainly working with decision makers and supporting them to integrate climate change into their decisions. Blue is Umfula, who works in Tanzania and Malawi, looking to improve climate information in this region and how it can be integrated into decisions around the energy, water, food nexus. And then green is High Crystal, who works in East Africa to improve understanding of East African climate change and supporting decision makers to integrate this climate information into planning. And then we go all the way to West Africa, which is red, and that's AMA 2050, who work at improving the understanding of the West African monsoon and helping West African societies to prepare and adapt. And then lastly, there is Impala, which has a Pan-Africa focus, improving the climate models that are used to predict Africa's climate. So this really is a short snapshot or overview of what FCFA does, but there is such a vast array of groundbreaking work and research coming out of FCFA. So I highly encourage you to all visit our website and browse through all the resources and news stories to learn more. Next slide, please. So FCFA has been working with African journalists through various activities in the past, one of which was partnering with Climate Home News, where FCFA sponsored 10 journalists to write news stories. You can see 2 snippets from Zimbabwe news stories here. Next slide, please. FCFA also supported an in-person training with BBC Media Action in Tanzania, which brought together climate scientists and journalists to create a 2-way knowledge exchange to help them better communicate climate change. And then, of course, we also had our first online journalist training, which happened in October. And this is the second version of that. Next slide. So if you want to find out any more information, please go to our website, or if you have any queries relating to FCFA research or any ideas for news stories on FCFA research, please send me an email. I'm really looking forward to the next few days with you all. And so now I'd like to hand over to the facilitator for this training, Leonie Jabert. FCFA has worked with Leonie on a number of climate change stories. She's very experienced in climate change and environmental reporting, and I'm happy to now hand over to her to facilitate. Thanks, Leonie.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to join all of you today. As Beth said, my name is Leonie. I'm a science writer based in Cape Town in South Africa, and I have been working in the field of climate and environmental reporting for about 20 years. I also work in the area of energy policy and food security, specifically in the urban context within Africa, and have also done a lot of training over the years, both with journalists and with scientists to try and support around how to report on these topics appropriately and usefully. So today I'm going to be joined by Sophie Mbugua, who is joining us from Nairobi. Sophie also has many years of experience as an environmental journalist, and she focuses mostly on sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Africa, but also brings a specific journalistic skill to the table, which is going to be useful for us. She is a specialist as a multimedia science journalist. And given the change of the digital landscape in the past few years and the significance of that footprint on the African continent, this means her skills are very valuable to us. Throughout the course of the 3-day workshop, we're going to be joined by a number of experts, some to support us in understanding the science of climate change, and others to support on the media front, the media's approach to reporting on these. Today, our resident scientific expert is Dr. Abubakar Babikir, who is a climate scientist at the IDAG Climate Prediction and Application Center. He's also based in Nairobi. He has a doctorate in atmospheric science and oceanography from the Department of Meteorology at Stockholm University. He's really useful to us and important to us because not only is he a climate scientist, but he works very closely in the area of communicating this climate information in a way that is useful both to the public and also to policymakers. So he's going to be a strong support for us through this process. I'm going to just very briefly introduce you to what the importance is of doing this training, what the training hopes to accomplish, and then we're going to just deal with some of the process issues so we can all understand how to use this platform very smoothly. And delighted to say that we have journalists from around the continent joining us today, from every time zone in Africa. So a little bit of background and context. Nearly half a century ago, so in 1972, which was before many of us were born, a very important piece of modeling and analysis was released by a collaboration between the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a global think tank called the Club of Rome. They produced a report called The Limits to Growth. And in it, they used modeling to show basically that we cannot have infinite economic growth on a finite planet. And that if we continued with the trends of consumption, production, pollution, we would start to see serious consequences unfolding by the end of the century. So we've had 50 years of scientific evidence or scientific analysis warning us that we need to change our economic model globally. And yet here we are. We are facing ecosystem collapse, the 6th mass extinction, and we're starting to see our climate shifting into completely or an unstable state that really will have very serious consequences for all of our countries and our communities. So we really are in a planetary emergency. And then you'll probably remember in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its really seminal report called the 1.5 degree report. And in essence, they said we have 12 years in which to radically reduce our carbon pollution if we want to slow the trends that we're seeing. Of course, we're now in 2020, so that window is even smaller. And essentially what it means for all of us is that the reporting we do in the next 10 years is absolutely critical to helping us address this planetary emergency. I've been working in this field for 20 years, and it's quite distressing to get to this side of 20 years and realize that the situation is actually worse. It's not better. So what is the role of the media within all of this? You know, a strong functional media is a load-bearing wall within any healthy democracy. Our role is to keep an eye on government. It's to inform the public so that the public can become more civilly active, not just showing up at voting stations once every 4 or 5 years, but to keep an eye on government's day-to-day decision-making and policy-making. And it is ultimately to shift the public discourse and to challenge the status quo. Climate change reporting within that, it's probably the same in most of your newsrooms, is that the climate story is often shoved into the environmental beat, which is often seen as a nice to have beat, that most newsroom resources and most newsroom space is given to the more important stories like politics or economics or health. In South Africa, even the sports pages get way more newsroom resources than the environmental beat does. The purpose of this training is to just try and help us demonstrate that the climate story is not an environmental story. It fits into the politics beat, it fits into the economics beat, development issues, gender issues, social and environmental justice issues, agriculture, food and nutrition, urban development, you name it. Climate change is going to destabilize democracies, it's going to force migration, it's going to force conflict, it's going to threaten the very basics we need to survive, such as water and food. It's going to damage city infrastructure. And these are all critical issues that we need to be covering on a day-to-day basis on the front pages of our newspapers. And of course, I mean broadcasters as well. So what we would like to do through this training is to just work together so that we can join the dots between the global science and then what it means in our local context within our local constituencies. And obviously in Africa, our focus needs to be, while we do need to be part of the mitigation process of trying to throttle down and reduce carbon pollution, our primary focus is on understanding what the impacts will be for us, and then to think about adaptation responses, because that's where I think the bulk of our continent's energy needs to go in order to brace ourselves for a very uncertain future. All right, and this process, so we're going to be looking at the science of climate through these 3 days of workshops, and we're going to be looking at how journalists deal with that. And then what we would like to do is have a learning by doing process as well. So we're going to give all of you an opportunity to take what we learn in this process and to come up with our own story idea, the kind of story that we would pitch to our editor. And tomorrow and Wednesday, we're going to give all of you an opportunity to just put together a 2-minute pitch where you tell us what your angle is, what kind of topic you would like to cover. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the program. So some very basic housekeeping, just so that we can allow this platform to run as smoothly as possible. When we have Q&A sessions where you'll have an opportunity to ask for clarification either on the science or on the journalistic aspect of what we talk about, throughout the process, all of your mics will be on mute so that we don't have interruption with background noise. But if you have an opportunity to speak, we'd just like you to turn on your microphone, but also turn on your video so that we can see your face. It's really lovely to see the human being on the other side of the camera. And you'll be invited to present your question. Just try and keep it nice and brief so that everyone can have a turn if necessary. If there are any connection problems and we see that you're trying to speak but you're not coming through, our tech people will then just put you onto mute. That'll be a signal to you that we can't hear you. And then we would like to give you a second option or platform where you can then put your question to us. And that is in an online Google document where you'll be sent the link in the little chat window. Just go into that document and type up what your question is. And then we will read it to the group. All right. And we do have a scheduled tea break. So at some point, we'll just say 5-minute tea break. We'll have a little video and a timer playing in the background. So don't stray too far from your computer and keep an eye on that timer so that as soon as the 5 minutes is up, we'll launch back into the next part of the program. At the end of today's session, we would like to take a group photograph of everyone. So we'll talk you through the process of that a little bit later. If you do have any technical issues, we are putting an email address into the chat window. So if you're struggling for any reason, just drop our tech team a little message saying what your issue is. All right, and just one further reminder is that on Wednesday, our session is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be 2 hours because we may have a little bit of extra content to go through. So if you could just bear that in mind. All right, so if all of you, we just want to check that all of you have heard us and you're on board. If you could go into your chat window or your participants window and just put up your hand, wave your hand, then we can know that you've heard us and you've understood us. Great, excellent. Thank you so much. Right, okay, so let's launch into our program today. We're going to start with a half-hour session where we're going to look at some of the most updated science around the state of the climate, as well as what some of the implications are for us as a continent. So this will be, so Dr. Abubakar Babikir will be handling this session. We have pre-recorded the session, but we would like Abubakar to just turn on his screen very briefly and say hello to everyone before we run the recorded video so that you can see his face and the human behind the video. Do we have Abubakar with us now? All right, so we seem to be having some connection problems with Abubakar. So if I could ask the tech team to just start running his video, please.
Hi, my name is Abubakar Saleh Babikir. I am a climate scientist at the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'll be talking to you today about climate change impact and adaptation in Africa. I would like to start by thanking Future Climate for Africa for this opportunity to talk to journalists. And I would like also to recognize my project, which is Intra-ACP Climate Services and Related Application, funded by the European Union and implemented by the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center. So I'll here the outline of my talk. I will be talking to you about just brief summary of the main finding of the IPCC report of 1.5 degree warmer climate. And then I'll tell you why the next 8 to 9 years are important in determining the rate of warming of the climate system. And then I'll just give brief examples from West and South and East Africa on the impact of climate change. And then I'll give a short summary in the end. So Paris Agreement, the upper target of Paris Agreement is keeping the warming of the climate system at below 2 degree warmer climate. But some of the island countries, they were really worried that a 2 degree warmer climate might be too dangerous for them. So they pushed for a more ambitious target within the Paris Agreement, and that is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then IPCC was asked to give an assessment of how, or for assessment of 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer climate. What is the situation? Possible, doable, and what are the options? So the summary or the major finding of the report that the warming from the anthropogenic emission from pre-industrial time up to the time of the report writing, which is about 2017 and then released in 2018, is 1 degree Celsius, and it will persist in the future. The report also said that these emissions alone are not likely to lead to 1.5 warmer climate, but what matters is the behavior after that. What are we, or the policy will be adopted after this time period. What we will do in the future in the so, and then most of the adaptation needs will be lower at 1.5 warmer climate than 2 degree warmer climate. And the risk to different socio-economic sectors, to health, to food security and livelihood, for all these sectors, the risk is lower under 1.5 warmer climate than, and it will increase further if we go to 2 degree Celsius warming. So, and one of the major also findings of the report that limiting the warming to 1.5 degree Celsius is possible within the laws of physics and chemistry, but doing so would require unprecedented changes in our behavior and in our consumption, of course, of fossil fuel. So this is one of the graphs. IPCC report usually are rich with graphs, and the graphs are very detailed. So the orange line here shows the trend from the anthropogenic warming from 1960 up to 2017, the time of the preparation of the report. And then around here, you see this orange area. This shows the uncertainty around this estimation. So how the range of uncertainty look like around this estimation of the anthropogenic warming. But the line shows you the trend, the common trend. And then the gray area here shows the projected future of warming in case we manage to cut down the carbon dioxide emission to net zero by 2055. So these are the potential scenario of the trend in temperature will be if we manage to cut the CO2 to net zero. And then another graph also here, it shows how the emission, for example, up to 2020, if we continue up to 2020, burning with the same rate, and then started to cut drastically to reach that target of net zero carbon dioxide emission by 2055. Or another, if we manage to do that, the green line here, showing if we manage to do it earlier, like 15 years earlier, 2040. So those are the potential scenarios of cutting the emission of carbon dioxide so that we can be in the right track toward 1.5 degree warmer climate. So why the next 9 years, for example, are important? That has something to do with what we call the interdecadal variability in the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is one of the major ocean systems in the globe, and the oceans generally help actually in mitigating the impact of the global warming on the anthropogenic warming because they absorb the heat. About 90% of the heat from the anthropogenic warming is absorbed by the ocean. So the ocean is serving as a storage for the heat. But that is also leading to other issues with the ocean. But now the Pacific Ocean has this kind of mode of variability. The temperature varies. So it goes into a negative mode, which is a bit colder than the usual. And it takes several years to move into another mode, which is, we call it a positive mode, which is warmer than usual. So it is now expected that if the Pacific moved into a positive mode of warming, we will very likely, if we are in the same path of emission, we will very likely reach the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2026. So maybe in the next 5 years or something like that. But if the Pacific remain in a negative mode, which is colder than usual, we are likely to reach the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 5 years later, by 2031. So these are the behavior, those are the behavior of the climate system. There is room that if we ride on this wave of negative mode and we cut down the emission, that might be helping on a positive side. But if we don't and remain burning with the same rate, so, and then the interannual or the variability, the natural variability in the ocean catch up with us, we will be heading to a warmer climate very soon, of 1.5 degrees Celsius very soon in the maybe next 5 years. So this is the issue of the 9 to 10 years, the importance of this. So this is about the IPCC report and the research on this area. I'll now move to tell you about what is actually happening, in the ground. The graph you are seeing here in the right panel, it is from the climate trackers, which they produce this kind of tracking for the policy and for the situation and the pledge from the countries toward the target of Paris Agreement. So if you can look here, that we have now we are at about 1.1 degree warming. Currently, this is the most recent one, which is produced in September 2020. And the target of Paris Agreement is, of course, the lower target is 1.5 degrees Celsius. But now let's look at the pledge from the countries when they submit their NDCs and their commitment to Paris Agreement. You can see that the current pledge, the promises from the countries that are signed the Paris Agreement, the pledge will lead us to, on average, a warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. These are the pledges. So it is far from what is even the upper target of Paris Agreement, which is 2 degrees Celsius warming, keeping the warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But now, even the worst situation is what are the actual policies? What is happening in the ground? It is even worse than the scenario of the pledge. The actual policies, the current policies, on average, will lead us to 2.9 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and even to a very severe situation about maybe 4 degrees Celsius warmer climate by the end of the century. So there is a real need here that not only the pledge to be more ambitious, but there is need to commit to these pledges in a way that make us reach the target of Paris Agreement of 1.5 warmer climate, or at least 2 degrees Celsius warmer climate in the future. So this is about the IPCC report and what is the current policy and the pledge and what is the current situation of warming in the climate system. I will move now to give some just a general idea about, for example, for us in Africa, why climate change is really important an issue. And as you can see that in Africa, most of our economic growth is really linked to rainfall and to the climate in general. And many of the studies show that the GDPs can be very sensitive to reduction in agricultural output. For example, Kenya lost almost 10% of its GDP in the year of 1997 due to the severe flood due to the El Nino event. And the graph you are seeing here on the right-hand side, it shows the behavior of the 5 years mean GDP compared to the rainfall. The lines are really striking in their similarity and in their behavior. So you can see that how the African economies are quite sensitive to climate variability, or specifically rainfall. That because most of our economies are highly dependent on natural resources. So, and the natural resources, of course, for example, agriculture, livestock, forestry, and all other ecosystem services, they are all sensitive to climate variability. So it's immediately reflected on our economies. So now I was telling about the oceans and that the oceans are absorbing the heat. Let's take an example of the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean has been warming rapidly during the past 100 years. So this is a study. It shows that by Roxy et al., I think it is published in 2016. It shows how the Indian Ocean is warming compared to the western part of the Indian Ocean. And you can see that the warming is in the western parts, specifically of the Indian Ocean, it reached 1.2 degrees Celsius in the summer. So it is even higher than the global average warming. Now, for the Indian Ocean, because there's neighboring countries and the neighboring continent, they are being affected severely by this kind of warming, because a warmer ocean usually lead to, for example, development of tropical cyclones. For example, the last year, about 8 tropical cyclones that developed over the western part of the Indian Ocean. You can see again here the trend of the warming of the Indian Ocean from this study, which is by Roxy et al., published in 2014, not 16, as I mentioned before. So the Indian Ocean also, as you know, that, for example, tropical cyclone Kenneth and Idai, which impacted Mozambique in last year, 2019, in March, around March, April. They were the strongest tropical cyclone record to hit Mozambique, and their impact actually went to other neighboring countries. This is a graph from Nature, and a study in Nature, and it shows that Idai is actually one of the most deadliest tropical cyclone in the recent history. For example, the other deadliest or impactful tropical cyclone, they happened, for example, in 1972 and 1944, mostly impacting Madagascar and Mozambique. But in the recent past, you would find that Idai is the strongest tropical cyclone to impact people. The impact of Idai also reached inland toward Malawi and Zimbabwe. And it is the strongest tropical cyclone, as I said, the strongest tropical cyclones happened to impact Mozambique. They happened in the past 20 years. The strongest tropical cyclones to hit Arabian Peninsula also happened in the last 15 years. And this is the impact of one of the tropical cyclones that also passed the coastal country, which is Oman, and made heavy rainfall over Saudi Arabia, over a desert region of Saudi Arabia. Is called the Empty Quarter. And that rainfall, this is a satellite image, the one on the left here, it shows you areas that are usually desert, but after the tropical cyclone made landfall, it became like there is pockets of lakes or desert lakes over that region. And this gave the suitable environment for the breeding of the desert locust. And from there, it emerged to Yemen and remained there uncontrolled because of the political conflict in Yemen. And then it migrated because of another tropical cyclone to East Africa. So it impacted Djibouti and impacted Somalia. And again, when it is in Somalia, because of also conflict and political instability, it was unchecked and wasn't controlled. And then from there, it emerged to Ethiopia, migrated to Ethiopia and Kenya. And for Kenya, it is the worst desert locust invasion in 70 years. So you can see how these factors are playing together. You have a warmer ocean, lead to development of tropical cyclones. The tropical cyclones are deadliest by themselves, or they cause, for example, other disaster, like providing the environment for the growth of or breeding of the desert locusts, and then you have political instability come to play in the picture. Desert locusts remain uncontrolled, and then impact the whole other countries and devastate the livelihood of population. So I want you from this to see how actually climate change work like as a butterfly. You know, you have it kind of initiate some, because of this severity, can initiate a severe event, and then that severe event is escalated further due to other socio-economical and political factors. So the same situation also, the heavy rainfall or the warming of the ocean caused us in West Africa heavy rainfall during 2019, which led to Lake Victoria reaching the highest record. This graph down here showing the Lake Victoria reaching a highest level in 120 years, and the picture shows the areas that are flooded by Lake Victoria during last year. Okay, if we move to West Africa, most of my examples before are from East Africa, whether it's Northeast Africa or the southern part of East Africa, like Mozambique and Malawi. But now, if we go to East Africa, you would see that also the warming of the climate is really evident. This is two pictures from a study by Silla et al., published in 2016, which shows from 1983 up to the anomalies between 1983 up to 2010. In some areas, they are even reaching 0.5 degree warmer climate. And this is during the rainy season, which is the season from May to September, which is the season of the growing season. So such warming actually is quite risky, because for agriculture also it kind of hinder the ability of the plant to benefit from the rainfall, because instead of the water staying in the soil to irrigate the plant, it will evaporate faster because of the warmer climate condition. So it will reduce. It was kind of like have the warming temperature kind of causing a semi-drought effect by reducing the benefit of the plant from the rainfall. And this is the same study also showing the trend, for example, in the warming from and going forward in the future according to different climate change scenarios. So if we, for example, stay in business as usual scenario, which we call it 8.5 scenario. So you can see that for different sub-regions in West Africa, the temperature trend is just going upward, up to maybe it will reach 4 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of this century. While on the right hand side of the panel, you can see this is the trend, the expected trend for the rainfall. It's almost remained constant. It's not much changing in terms of rainfall, but the temperature is growing. And this will bring me to the point that I have mentioned earlier, which is if you have rainfall, for example, the same amount of rainfall stay as it is, but your temperature is getting warmer, you are heading to kind of a situation of a drought by losing the ability to benefit from the rainfall due to warmer conditions that lead to evaporation. And in West Africa, this is also data from OSHA for this year, 2020. It shows that the number of people have been affected by floods during this year due to heavy rainfall is about 2.1 million, which is double of the number of the affected people in the past year. And these all are signals that are predicted by scientists from very early stage on the impact of climate change. That climate change will increase the rate of extreme weather events, because a warmer atmosphere will have more ability to hold water. And when it rains, it will rain heavily and it will cause flood and such kind of devastation. For Southern Africa, as you probably all know, South Africa is warming very rapidly. These are two examples of the warming, for example, over South Africa itself as a country, but it gives you an idea about the rate of warming over the southern part of Africa generally, which is almost double of the warming, the global warming, double of the global, the average warming in the climate system. So okay, these are just glimpses of climate change, that is the impact of our continent. I would like just to come into summarizing few points here that keeping the warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius is doable, but it requires drastic measures in cutting CO2 emissions, and that the adaptation cost is lower for 1.5 warmer climate than for 2 degree warmer climate. And then, as you have seen by yourself, the evident impact of climate change on our continent in increasing the extremes from heavy rainfall, floods, tropical cyclones, and higher temperature, which is by itself having exacerbating impact of like a drought situation. And then the climate change will lead to extreme, and their impact, the impact of these extremes is very likely to be exacerbated further by other socio-economical factors. For example, armed conflict, political instability, they might very likely exacerbate the impact from climate change. And finally, I would like just, of course, as you well know, that the poorest and the least contributing communities to the greenhouse gases emission are the most vulnerable to climate change. So there is a real need that all of us call for climate justice for these people to have a fair shot in this planet. So with that, I would like to thank you, all of you, and I will be available with you here for any questions if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. That was a very enlightening conversation. Thank you for that. All right, so we are now going to have a very short tea and bathroom break, just to let everyone stretch their legs. We're going to play just a short video and a countdown timer to let you know where we are. Please don't stray too far from your computers, but let's take a very quick breather and then we'll pick up with the program in 5 minutes' time. Right, so welcome back, everyone. So Abu Bakr has joined us. We've managed to get him back online again. We're going to have a session a little bit later, a slot a little bit later on in the program where you can direct questions either to Abu Bakr or to Sophie and myself. So keep your questions primed in the meantime. And of course, you're also welcome to type them in the Google Docs if you would like to. But the next session, Sophie and I are just going to spend a few minutes chatting with you now about how, giving case studies of how both of us have joined the dots between some of this big global science and locally relevant stories within our regions. So a case study I'm going to present to you now is a story that I wrote for an online South African newspaper called The Daily Maverick. And this demonstrates some of the points that we want to make throughout this program. So in the context of climate reporting, a lot of the science that we have to get our heads around might not look like it's immediately related to climate change. For instance, the physics and the chemistry of climate, which is what Abu Bakr has just demonstrated. And this case study is about global tree planting and using our natural ecosystems as carbon sinks to try and mop up some of the carbon pollution from the atmosphere. So one of the sort of big sort of global drives is to push for mass tree planting and mass afforestation in order to put more trees onto the planet so that they can draw carbon pollution from the atmosphere and then lock it down in the soil, in the timber, in the leaves, and basically clean that, that carbon from the atmosphere. But the policy implications of this is that a lot of the push from the global north is to try and get countries in the global south to plant forests extensively. And this is it's coming through in international negotiations, and it even comes through in development aid, funding agendas, etc. But we can't have one sort of single tree planting policy for the whole planet. And many parts of Africa are covered extensively with savanna and with grassland ecosystems. And even though these kinds of ecosystems don't store quite as much carbon as, say, a tropical forest would by hectare, because these ecosystems cover so much of the continent, they are very significant carbon sinks. And they really need to be kept intact. We don't want to be mass planting forests into those ecosystems and then disrupting them. These ecosystems are also very important for livestock grazing and for wildlife, which of course has a biodiversity implication as well as a tourism implication. So we don't want any inappropriate planting of trees into these ecosystems. So I want to just talk you through a process that I went through recently to demonstrate how this was turned into a climate story. Two important scientific papers came out earlier this year. The first was a paper where scientists calculated just how much the full extent of the carbon pollution that these ecosystems in Africa have been drawing out of the atmosphere in the past 30 years. And they calculated that it was a significant amount of carbon. So essentially, our healthy savanna and grasslands have been working very hard over the past 30 years to clean up pollution that has largely come from the global north. There was then a second paper released where a number of South African scientists expressed their concern that because of funding agendas from the global north, it was potentially pushing African countries to agree to adopt policies of mass planting of trees, which might be inappropriate in these forests, in these savannas and ecosystems. So why is this story political? Because our governments could end up accepting or agreeing to global north funding, global north policies, and it could even influence what we agree to in terms of various climate commitments. And there could also be the potential for undue influence of the private timber industry. So the science behind how these different ecosystems is a little bit too complicated and long-winded to go into, or long to go into right now. But this case study, and I'll send you the link to the story that I wrote if you're interested in reading it. There were three really important lessons from a journalistic perspective that come through from this case study. The first is that the kinds of science that we have to get our heads around is much, much more than just the basics of how the atmosphere climate system works and how additional carbon pollution in the atmosphere disrupts that. And every story that we do is going to require us to sink our teeth into possibly a new area of science. And that means we have to keep upskilling ourselves and finding the appropriate experts to help teach us and explain to us how these things work. The second take-home message is the importance of good, strong relationships with experts. In fact, it was some of my sort of long-standing scientific contacts who alerted me to these 2 papers in the first place, sent them to me, and then helped talk me through these very dense papers, which are quite difficult to understand. And this was essentially drawing on probably about 10 different scientific experts, some working at universities, some working with civil society organizations in the conservation sector who do various different forms of evidence-based research in the field. And then also a number of these experts that I work with are people I've known for 20 years, just through constantly working in an area. And you will know this within whatever beat you may be working in. So much of the strength and your effectiveness in your beat is building these really strong relationships with experts where you trust them and they trust you. So I can't emphasize strongly enough how important it is to build those networks. And then, of course, it's this process that we each have to go through in terms of joining the dots between the science and then writing a story that is relevant to our readership or to our broadcast listeners. You know, there's no textbook that we can download to just tell us how to do it. It really is, we have to use our own sort of creative problem-solving processes and the skill that we have built up over the years as journalists to do this. All right. So I now am going to hand over to Sophie, who is going to demonstrate to us how she's done something similar within her own news beat.
Thanks, Leonie. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sophie Mbogwa, as Leonie mentioned, and I concentrate much on writing about climate change, how communities are being affected by climate change, and also solutions, what solutions they're coming up with. So I am going to talk you through a podcast I did, because I ran a podcast every week on Tuesdays on Africa Climate Conversations, and basically having experts come on board and explain, talk about different conversations. So on climate change and how it's affecting sub-Saharan Africa. So what happened is last week, let me just send you a link to that. I did a podcast looking into climate information services, climate change information. And the question was, is Africa investing enough on understanding its climate impact? The thing is, if you know, when we were listening to, I sent you a link to the chat, and the science is very clear. As you listen to Babika, he was explaining how the climate change climate has happened. And scientifically, it's very clear on what is happening within the continent. But the question is understanding what governments are doing, and because that is our responsibility as journalists, and asking, what are we doing? Different sectors, are our sectors aligned in terms of climate change impacts, and what is also a government doing? Because then you look at the climate change story. For the longest time, there's a lot of clear evidence in terms of how it's affecting health, agriculture, and that has been the bits that we've concentrated so much on. But then again, there are different other aspects of economy, the water sector, the energy sector, because when you look at the majority of African countries, they depend on hydro for energy generation. When you look at, for those ones in southern part of the region, when you look at Kariba Dam, especially guys in Zimbabwe, when you look at Zambia, how important is that particular ecosystem to your energy generation? When you look into issues of conflict and water issues around both rural areas and the cities, you have to ask yourself in terms of the water sector, to what extent, like communities, you look into different areas like the western part of the region, when you look into the pastoralist communities and the conflict that comes in between the issues of pastoralist and the issues of agriculture farmers, and the issues of conflict and the competition when it comes to water. And so this particular podcast was asking, looking into asking the question in terms of how is I'm just going to share my screen. And this is the conversation. I interviewed a scientist who is an IPCC lead scientist, and James Kenyangi, who is from the AFDB. And we are looking into how the continent is investing in understanding how the climate has changed in the past and now and even in the future, because the most important thing is also like having not just only understanding what is happening, but then again our sectors being aligned and being climate proof, and also in terms of policies that we are having within Africa, making sure that they address that we are having, if it's infrastructure, for example, cities, when you look into how building of the roads, how climate proof is that, understanding how the climate has changed in the past, how it's changing now, and how it will change in the future in terms of, so that to make sure that the development we are doing as Africa develop, it is actually aligned, it's actually climate proof, the kind of development that we do, because you don't want to have a section where a road is being built, but then again, we haven't looked into 10 years from now, how that road will look like, how the climate will look like, and probably there'll be a lot of flooding within the cities and stuff. And then you're not looking into how do we climate proof these particular roads and infrastructure to make sure that you do not have a road that you build, spend too much money, government spending too much money today, but then again tomorrow that road, or in 10 years or 5 years down the line, that road will not be important. So it's a podcast. It's a 30 minutes podcast, and looking into the meteorological department, looking into how we invest in, because the question I would want to ask is that in terms of their own countries, majority of the Met departments in many African countries are very, very poor. So you find that countries are not able to actually, they still depend on the larger kind of infrastructure, like understanding how the climate, for example, looking into the Lake Victoria in Kenya, you find that Kenya doesn't have a very good system that is able to actually monitor how the storms within the Lake Victoria, so that when it comes to localized storms, like localized understanding how is the particular effect that are happening within that particular region. And so it's very important for us as journalists to ask ourselves, how are our Met departments, and to what extent is our government investing in infrastructure to understand how climate is happening and impacting different sectors? Because you look into how, if the water sector is affected, if we do not have enough water, if in the cities we do not have, the water sector is affected, and how climate is actually going to impact the water availability in future. To what extent are you living in the city going to be impacted in terms of access to energy? And what does that mean when impact the hydrological departments, the energy department is affected and we have less water? That means when it comes to tariffs, energy tariffs that are also affected. And so you pay extra for those of you living in the cities for energy. And when it comes to like different other sectors within the rural sectors and also within the cities, to what extent are they impacted? So mine is just looking into, pushing like you to think of just beyond what it is that, apart from the health sector, apart from the energy sectors, what are the different sectors within your cities are being affected? When you look into cities also, we look into countries like Gambia, the Gambia. When you look into Gambia, you find that science will actually tell you like the majority of Gambia's capital, the Banjul, is less than 1 meter above the sea level. And so as climate impact increase, it is likely to increase the tropical storms and then intensify flooding in that particular city. So when you look into such kind of a city, if you're living in such city, as a journalist, what kind of stories do you ask in terms of the government? How is the planning? How is the government having an infrastructure that is able to map, to understand in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years, in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years, how will the climate be for Banjul as a city? And how is it likely that the intensified, the tropical storms, how are they likely to affect the people? How are they likely affecting the agriculture sector? How are they likely affecting the city of Banjul? The infrastructure that the Banjul city is actually coming up with. How is the government understanding? To what extent does it understand that? And how is it that different sectors make decisions based on this particular information. And so those are some of the questions when it comes to probably like we can ask ourselves in terms of as journalists. When you look into the Mombasa, it's the same case, Mombasa city, because majority of African cities are built within the water bodies. For years, it was actually very helpful in terms of communicating that and also trade. But then when you look into the climate scenarios, how climate is likely to change, this particular infrastructures, this particular cities are likely to have very intensified flooding. And so it's those things looking into climate justice, looking into like communities that are living there. When you look at Mombasa, you have people who farm. And so when you have too much rising sea level rises, and so the chance that the city is going to, you have too much water level that are rising, that is salty water. So if it makes up with agriculture land, the salt within, the land within agriculture areas. So you find you have waterlogged areas, and also that affect agriculture. And also to what extent does that affect availability of fresh water sources? So it's such kind of stories that doing this particular podcast was asking myself in terms of understanding, how does African governments, how are they investing in infrastructure that is helping to map, to actually understand, apart from what the IPCC says, but then again, localized kind of effects? How does climate change, how is it changing now? Has it changed in the past? How is it changing now? How is it likely to change in the future? And so that, how is it actually likely to affect our different sectors, not just the food availability, but also the water sector, the energy sector, communities who are marginalized for so many years? How is it likely to bring in issues of conflict? How is it likely to affect the issues of migration? How does it affect budgeting for the countries? Because then again, countries are growing, but then again, if you look, for example, in terms of Mozambique right now, it's focusing on rebuilding the city of Beira. So government had made plans, but then again, such disasters happen. But then again, the money that the government had put aside for development, for infrastructure development, that goes into rescuing people. To what extent is our government investing in early warning systems? Because those are some of the questions. Because then again, if we have early warning, if we are understanding the system, how it's likely to change, then we make informed decisions. That is what the podcast, I'd advise you to listen to it and actually understand, because it looks into different regional areas, and you'll understand how also your countries are doing, your regions are doing in terms of investing in climate change information. Thank you, Leonie.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. That was great input. What Sophie and I are going to do over the next couple of days with you also is to help you identify where some of the best sources are, both for the science and for sort of other components of reporting on these issues. But I would urge all of you to stay in contact with the Future Climate for Africa initiative, because this has drawn together a pool of highly skilled scientists from across our own continent, as well as in Europe and the United Kingdom. And many of these are really at the forefront of doing modeling and analysis that is specific to our own regions. So if you ever need a starting point to find good scientific explanations for issues relating to any of the topics we're covering, that is a very good place to start, so that you can start building up this network of experts who are on speed dial, should you need them. All right, so what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes is to just open this up to a question and answer session. If you have any questions for Abu Bakr or for myself or Sophie, either on the science of climate change or media's response to that, you can direct it to any of us. We would ideally like to see you or to hear your voice asking your question. So what I'll invite you to do is, in the participants window, if you have a question, just put up your hand, and I'll ask you by name to come online. If you could unmute your microphone and switch on your video when it's your turn to talk, then just briefly ask your question and maybe say who it's directed at. then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, if you have any difficulties with this, then just type your question into the Google Docs. So please, anyone have a question, fire away. Maybe what we can start with is I'll read Charles's question. Oh, wait, there we go. Partis has a question. Would you like to switch on your video and your mic and ask us the question? Partis, are you there? All right, so Partis, no? Okay, so I'm going to ask Charles's question. Charles has asked, as clearly explained, there is a link between climate change and the economy. Now, what should countries like Zambia do to avert the negative impact that climate change has on energy? Much of Zambia's energy is from hydro. I think, Abu Bakr, that is a question you should address if you can. Is Abu Bakr with us? I don't think so. All right. Apologies about that. All right. Sophie, given that this is close to your region, do you have anything that you would like to respond to? I'll also give it some thought.
I just hold on.
Sorry, I missed the question.
Yeah.
Someone
There
asked?
we go. Oh, sorry, Abu Bakr. Okay, so this question is I think, one that you're probably best positioned to answer. Charles asked, as has been explained, there is a strong link between climate change and the economy. Now, what should a country like Zambia do to avert the negative impact that climate change has on energy, since much of Zambia's energy is from hydropower?
Yes, okay, thank you for that question. Just again, my name is Abu Bakr and I'm in Nairobi at the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center. So for the energy sector, and especially, for example, hydropower, I think Sophie have mentioned that before, there is really need to benefit from climate information. So climate will always be variable, whether it is changing or not changing. There is another element of variability. We call it climate variability, which is the changes that happen from one year to another, or even in a shorter time scale. For example, on the weather scale, from one day to another, or from within 1 week, you have always this kind of variability in the system. And then add to that the challenge of climate being warmer and changes. So to manage this kind of variability and changes, you need information. So if you know what is going to happen next week, or maybe the next month, or the next 3 months, or the next 10 years, you would be able to have a better plan and to adjust, and maybe to look into other alternatives and avoid climate and weather shock. So one of the major things that we recommend is to be climate informed. So for example, climate change and climate information should be mainstreamed in all socio-economical sectors. If you are building a dam, you have to calculate or to look into, for example, future scenarios of climate in that area. For example, what will happen? What is going to happen to the river? What is going to happen to the rainfall in that area? So you have this in your planning. When you are at operational level, and we have very good experience actually with Kenya Power here, KNGen. We have very good partnership with them. They access our forecast from 1 week forecast to monthly forecast to seasonal forecast. And that helps them a lot to adjust and to plan their energy production between hydropower and other different sources. So I would recommend really climate information to be mainstreamed in all our developmental plan. I think that would help us to adjust very much.
Great. Thank you, Abu Bakr. There's what I would urge all of you to do is also to take a look at some of the really useful analysis and modeling that the FCFA has done around this very issue. So in some parts of sort of East and Southern Africa, they've looked at the trade-offs that have to be made around water management. So for instance, in areas where you have strong hydropower dependence, there's been interesting analysis looking at what the trade-offs will be, because you have this nexus, the energy, water, food nexus. And, you know, what happens if a government's policy is to use this amount of water for agriculture, that amount gets stored for keeping hydropower going, what will the implications be across the region? And now that you flagged this question, we can dig out some of the links to some of the research and some of the more popular stories that have been written around this, which might help just to inform your thinking. And then, of course, the idea would be to bring that thinking through into your journalism, so that you can remind policymakers that this kind of thinking is quite complex. All right, so I've just made a note to remind myself that we can send you some of those links later. Okay, let's try Tunisia, Phillips. Your hand is up. Would you like to put on your video and your mic and ask your question? Okay, nothing happening there. How about, okay, there we go. Eugene Myers, would you like to ask your question? Okay, we seem to be having trouble with some of our participants asking questions.
Hello?
There we go. Hi, Eugene, go ahead.
Yes, I understand Abu Bakr, when he in his presentations, he talked about the outbreak of locust, desert locust, and it had been a campaign from one region to another. I did fear that because it's currently in East Africa, Kenya to be exact, are there concerned that could reach developing country like Liberia in West Africa? Yeah.
Okay, Abu Bakr, would you like to answer that?
Say again, I just missed the last part, which is like he's asking whether it will affect Liberia in West Africa.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, okay. Desert locust, yes, it's a migratory pest, but it migrates from one point to another, depending on, for example, the weather pattern, especially the wind at certain level, and then the rainfall also on the other areas, and the vegetation cover and all those factors. So currently it is mostly in East Africa, so the far eastern part of Africa, some part of northern Kenya a bit, and Ethiopia, and then Somalia. We actually do run forecast for or like a prediction for the trajectory of desert locust movement. It is a bit unlikely that it will migrate to West Africa at the time, because of the wind pattern. The wind pattern are more northeasterly, so from the north toward the east. So it is not likely to migrate to West Africa at the moment. I don't see that in the forecast. So it's very likely it might continue in this region if remain uncontrolled. Unfortunately, in some countries, as I mentioned, the political instability plays a role. Some areas where the desert locust breeding became like inaccessible for controlling mission. But I don't see it going to West Africa in this round.
Thank you so much. Can I ask one final question?
Go for it.
Yes, Abu Bakr, in your presentation, you also said that it is possible for the world, for Africa to reverse the current rise in climate, in the temperature. But you said it's going to take it's possible, but it's going to be difficult. So I didn't really understand, what would it take for us to do that reversion? Is it money, resources, or is it what? Is it policy issues? Is it governmental willingness to apply some of the policies, the issues that you are coming up with?
Yeah, okay. If you're referring to the graph that I showed from the IPCC report, which
Yes.
is that is what required. That is not only for Africa. That is the global. That is what required from the global community, that we all of us to cut down the emission to net zero by 2055. So it's not only for Africa. Africa actually is not a major contributor to the greenhouse emission, especially CO2. There was a very interesting story actually in the Guardians early January this year. And the study show, I think they were reporting, there was an article reporting a study from, I don't remember the source of the study exactly, but it was published in the Guardian, the article, that, for example, the the British people per capita, the emission of the first 2 weeks surpassed some of the annual emission of some of African countries, like per capita. For example, per capita in Ethiopia or Rwanda, it is lower than what is the per capita emission from the British also per person, per capita. So you can see how, like in 2 weeks, the northern countries are already emitting our annual emission. So us, we are not the major contributors. So what is required from us is to mostly on the adaptation side, but also we are advised to leapfrog, for example, to avoid this path of development through burning of fossil fuel toward using green and renewable energy. That would be contributing positively to cutting the emission budget.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Abu Bakr. Just a quick reminder before we move on to the next questions. You know, a lot of climate change reporting, and I think Sophie alluded to this earlier, a lot of reporting often focuses on the rural impact. So the impact on things happening outside of cities, because agriculture is obviously such an important part of our regional economies. But we do also need to remember that, you know, 50% of most of our populations live within cities, and that the impact of climate change on cities and city infrastructure, city businesses, city functioning is also a really important part of this bigger story. We saw some interesting developments over the past few years. You know, not only did we have the Mozambican city of Beira almost wiped out by a cyclone, really important issues around city development. How does the city recover? During some of the extreme droughts that we've had across Southern Africa in the past few years, the city implications were, for instance, almost running out of water in Cape Town, where many small businesses were threatened by not being able to function. Many small businesses had to shut down for a considerable period of time because we had emergency water rationing measures in place. Very important story. Some important stories from Nairobi as well, during periods of extreme flooding, where parts of the city were shut down, people couldn't move around, many businesses couldn't operate because flooding prevented them from doing so. So again, this isn't one of those immediate sort of direct links that we often make when we report on these issues. So just a reminder that let's not forget about what's happening within our cities. All right, we have another question for Abu Bakr. This is from Gaspard. How can we describe the impact of climate change in the Lake Victoria area, which is known to share many things with other regional countries, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, if those ones do not make together the efforts to protect the area? And this is an important question, because essentially you've got a number of countries that are required to work together in order to manage a shared resource and to commonly and jointly manage responses to changes in that. So Abu Bakr, would you like to respond?
Yes, I maybe will. I will be taking maybe a partial part of that. Maybe then Sophie or you can complement on the political aspect. But I from what we are seeing is that, for example, Lake Victoria is now expanding actually, especially during the past season. As I said, the western part of this Indian Ocean is really affecting the climate in East Africa because it is the neighbor, the closest ocean system to East Africa. So warmer ocean usually result in more like evaporation from the ocean, or like lead to the increase of severe weather system. For example, the season of 2019 was really exceptional. The short rain, which we call it from October to December, and that has led to Lake Victoria reaching a highest level in 120 years. The forecast for the future, or the projection, is that there is a study recently. I will share the link shortly. A study by a team from University of Houston, I think, in the US. The study indicated that in the future climate projection, this period of the short rain, it is very likely to increase even to a double of the current amount in case of climate business as usual climate change scenario. So increase of the amount of rainfall is very likely to affect the lake itself. It will expand the communities that lives, and the communities and villages that are around the lake. They are very likely to be inundated by the expansion of the lake. The lake, for example, in this year in August, because of, as I said, it reached one of the highest level. The Ugandan authority let more water go northward, and that caused flood in South Sudan, and also contributed to the flood in North Sudan. Sudan and South Sudan both flooded heavily during this season, the rainy season, end of August. So climate change is very likely to exacerbate this kind of extreme, which will impact the local communities neighboring the lake itself, but also the other communities that share the lake with, or share the benefit of the lake with the neighboring countries. Yeah.
Sophie?
So I can let Leonie maybe continue on that, on the political issues, how multi countries can collaborate to control climate change in that sense.
Yeah, I think Sophie is well positioned to answer that.
Yeah, it's very true what Abubakar is saying, because the climate projection over the Lake Victoria. The question I think as journalists we need to ask ourselves now is, scientifically that is known. Then what are countries doing? Because then you have to look into to what extent is that particular lake important for Uganda, for Kenya, for Tanzania? And also you have to also look into different other issues when it comes to the Nile, because it's a source of the, within, you have to look into countries like Rwanda, you have to look into countries like Burundi. And the whole issue of having an understanding of what is already happening, how is it impacting, because you have to look into the fishermen and who depend on that particular lake every single day for their livelihood. And to what extent is that the knowledge that scientific have politically, is that particular knowledge understandable or being utilized by the decision makers in these particular countries for them to plan? Because if knowledge is power, and you have to have that knowledge for you to be able to plan, to make sure that these communities are safeguarded, and also to understand how important, if you're in Tanzania, you have to understand to what extent for tourism, how much revenue comes from this particular lake if you are in Uganda. And one of the most important things that I've seen in terms of when you look into Uganda, I don't know, when you're in Uganda, in Kampala, and it rains, there's a whole of flooding that floods all the water that actually comes into Nakivubo Channel, that drains all the way to the Lake Victoria, and all that amount of pollution. So you have to actually understand, look into how important is this lake for the region, and also for your individual countries, and to what extent, what are governments doing, and also look into the deforestation, because what happens, like for example, in Kenya, in Kisumu, it's very hot when it comes to Kisumu. And so Lake Victoria has a lot of storms. The the water that generates, that actually part of, when you look into the land and also the lake, and to that whole science that plays into part, and the decisions that are being made. And you have to ask yourself, in terms of investment, what government is actually doing, are scientific communities and politics working together? To what extent is the knowledge that scientific communities have, and is it informing decisions that the governments are actually making? Because one of the things that I've learned is that when you look into, Kenya doesn't have a radar to be able to monitor what's happening within the lake. Tanzania is actually having a radar, is installing that particular radar, but Kenya doesn't have. So if you're talking about giving this, safeguarding these communities, and the decisions that the government of Kenya is making in terms of planning for the future, and in terms of the knowledge that scientific communities have that is likely to happen as far as climate change is concerned over that lake. To what extent are they connected? To what extent are the decision being made within these communities? I mean, these countries, are they being informed by the scientific? Because that is our job as journalists to ask. Are the scientific communities working together? The knowledge they have, is it informing decision making in these particular countries? Those are some of the questions that probably some of the stories that we need to ask us. And to what extent is this play affecting communities, the decision that they're making? Are they having information like climate information, weather information? Are they knowing what is likely to happen so that when they go fishing, they do not get caught up in the storms and stuff like that? It's such questions that we need to start doing. It's such stories that we need to start interrogating. I want to also mention what is his name? Charles was asking about in Zambia. When you look into the Kariba Dam, and it's one of the questions that, it's one of the issues that James Kinyangi addressed on that particular podcast. You have, as a Zambian journalist, you ask yourself in terms of 85% of Zambia energy is from hydro. And so to what extent does Zambia depend on Kariba Dam? These particular rivers, what is happening upstream? What knowledge do Zambian Ministry of Energy has? To what extent does it know that these particular rivers, how are they going to change in terms of climate? How, to what extent do they understand? Like Kenya works, like Abu Bakr was saying, Kenya Power has access to climate and weather information, how it's going to change. So they have very good informed, as they're making decisions, they understand how the climate is likely to affect and the energy kind of generation. So you ask yourself in terms of Zambia, to what extent is Zambia dependent on hydro? To what extent is Zambia in different sectors, the energy sector, the agriculture sector, how is this knowledge, are they getting this knowledge from their Met? How well is the Met equipped to understand, to be able to monitor this on a day-to-day basis, on an hourly basis? Because then we have to be able to have this information for us to be able, for our sectors to be able to make informed decisions. So it's part of those stories that you start interrogating and asking yourself, how is your Met department equipped to be able to understand how the climate will change? How is the political, the energy sector, different other sectors having access to this information? Is this information informing sectors, different policies that are being made? Is it being used on a day-to-day basis? And then to what extent is businesses in the cities and also in the rural areas being affected by what are the energy crises that you're having? And then when you understand what the communities, scientific communities have, and understand to what extent is your government investing, even in research and understanding, and making sure that your scientists have a better equipped understanding and they have the money to do this kind of, research. It's those kind of questions that this kind of training is just trying to push into you to make sure that you ask those questions, and in your stories, they come on your day-to-day basis. Because when you look into our medias, in most cases, you find the stories that we do every other single day, there's so many questions that we're not asking. And it's those questions that we need to start asking. Do not just do the stories when climate stories, when it's flooding and when we have an energy crisis and when we have conflict and stuff. We need to make these climate stories every single bit in our day-to-day reporting and asking these particular questions, because it's affecting not just communities, but also us individuals and infrastructures, and also the decisions that the governments are making and the budgets that your governments are making every other single year. Yeah.
Mm. And also just to add to the question about Lake Victoria, there, you know, if you consider all of the cities and villages and towns that are right on the shore of the lake, all the way around, these are all communities that are going to be impacted by levels of water in the lake, which may change for various reasons. And of course, also likely to be impacted by flooding after extreme storm events. And the implication from a storytelling perspective is to find ways to get some of the most recent modeling that's coming through about what these impacts will be, and inform policymakers as well as hold policymakers accountable for the kinds of development and infrastructure and planning decisions they make around these cities. So for instance, which of these towns and cities are likely to be impacted by a changing water level within the lake? Are there stormwater systems in place? Are there emergency management plans in place? The plans for building additional infrastructure and allowing the city or the town to grow, are they appropriate, and do they take into consideration the kinds of impacts that climate modelers are warning us of? And I mean, Future Climate for Africa itself has done a lot of really good work in this area, showing what the sort of city infrastructure impacts might be for some of the communities on the edge of the lake. But that information is probably not getting through to the local level policymakers. So that's a really critical link that we all need to fill. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, Eugene has asked his question. Let's see, Patrice, are you able to ask your question? Let's hear someone's voice. Okay, maybe not. All right. Okay, so let's jump to Tunisia asks, in South Africa, the Department of Environmental Affairs, or the Minister of Environmental Affairs, mentioned that certain regions in Africa have already warmed at 1.5 to 2 degrees in her post-COP report back session. Can you direct me to the science and what does this mean for covering warming when the mainstream view tends to be a global focused perspective of warming and this rush to avoid 1.5 degrees? So just very briefly from my side, before I hand over maybe to Abubakar, there is some really important research that has come out of the University of Cape Town, the African Climate and Development Initiative at UCT, as well as CSAG, which is the Climate Systems and Analysis Group, and one or two others. Abubakar has already put some links into our chat window, and I'll add some more links later, which take you to some of the local publications that demonstrate that this warming is faster than the global average, and the implications of that. And I think the take-home message here is that we need to be reporting on the urgency of the situation, that so many of the impacts that we're seeing as a result of thickening atmospheric pollution is that many of the changes we were anticipating are actually happening faster than anticipated. Which heightens the emergency and maybe needs to heighten the tone that we use in our stories when we report on this. Some of the recent work from the University of Cape Town shows that Botswana region, and of course, you know, often these are framed within national boundaries, but of course these climate impacts don't stick within national boundaries. But there was some important research from UCT last year that showed that the Botswana region will exceed the 2 degree warming that the IPC is trying to avoid. Botswana region is basically already locked in to passing that threshold within less than 10 years, which again just reminds us of the absolute urgency of that. So yes, I will send a few more links after that to scientific papers. As a follow-up question, Tunisia asks, how can we highlight the importance of contentious issues at the IPCC talks regarding loss and damage already suffered, and the importance of finance? Oh, this is such a good question, and I think one that Sophie and I hope to answer a little bit more tomorrow. Covering these the international climate negotiations is particularly tricky because they are very technical. Sometimes it's hard if you're not actually at these negotiations to get into the room, to get to speak to the right people. But we will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Okay. So Abu Bakr, there's a question for you. Why is Africa worse affected by climate change when our contribution to CO2 is so little?
Yeah. Okay. Those are a bit separate in a way that we contribute little, but we are affected more by climate change. I think the reason for us for this sensitivity to African communities or African countries to climate change is due to the thing that I mentioned in the presentation, which is the high dependency on natural resources. We still in Africa depend highly on, for example, rain-fed agriculture, our livelihood. For example, many of the communities in Africa, they are pastoralist, and they benefit from the naturally growing grass and natural pastures. And many communities also live on the other different ecosystem services, and those are all sensitive, of course, to climate. So that is one element. When you have climate change, the climate changes from one state to another, or climate varies, or the variability became more severe and more intense, that will definitely affect our economical system. The other issue is also about development. We are still, most of the African countries are developing, in the developing stage. So our preparedness is not robust in a good way. For example, our roads, our bridges are still not well funded. So we have very little resources to invest in development. So sometimes the development doesn't happen in the best way that can be, for example, climate proofs or climate proofed. For example, a bridge, when they build a bridge or they build a road, people in many cases, they build it with the minimum, the smallest amount of budget. So they don't want to hike the prices. And so they try to minimize and not going to make it like in a climate-proof way that make all the infrastructure vulnerable to severe weather and floods and all those kind of things. But as we say that we are less contributing, so we have a room to argue with the developed countries that we should receive the support, for example, and the financial capacity that can help the African countries to build or to adapt to these new climate realities.
Great, thank you, Abu Bakr. I want to address Betty's question. So Betty asks, perhaps you can provide tips on how to re-angle stories that are more energy focused to tackle the climate story and make them relatable to your audience. I'm getting some feedback from someone's mic. If the tech people could just... Great, thank you very much for that help. Okay, so just quickly, so Betty wants to know, how do we re-angle stories that are more energy focused to a climate story and make them relatable to the audience? So making them relatable to the audience, I think that's a skill we basically learn on the job. I'm going to give you a little example from South Africa about this. So for instance, in the South African context, South Africa has often been described as the United States of Africa, or the USA of the African continent, because we have a very strong economy. I'm still getting feedback from someone. Thank you. Sorry, let me just gather my thoughts again. South Africa has a very strong economy, but it is very carbon polluting because of our history. A lot of mining and a lot of manufacture that is high polluting, and we contribute to almost half of the continent's emissions. So that makes us hugely responsible for the continent's carbon profile. The difficulty in the South African context is that even while we have huge potential to move from a coal-based energy system to one that is more strongly renewable, the problem is that we have a lot of vested interests within government to stay based in coal. We've had the Daily Maverick is a local publication that has done a lot of very deep, extensive investigative reporting on the vested interests within government, the corruption within government, which has led to government decision-making and policy-making that is largely favoring coal, the continued exploitation of coal, and basically putting roadblocks in place to prevent the kind of the scale and speed of transition to a renewable energy system that is possible and within reach. But unfortunately, a lot of the upper echelons of government are closely sort of friendly with people in the private sector, mining, etc., who have it within their own interest to keep the system as it is. So the Daily Maverick is a really good example of the deep, complicated investigative reporting that has been done in order to try and expose this corruption. So that's very much serving as a watchdog role. Sophie, would you like to jump in and speak to that question from your perspective in Nairobi?
Yes, Leonie, I would. One of the things that I've actually noted is that when we speak about climate change, and these stories, we have to humanize them, because put human faces on these particular stories. So I'm just going to put an example on what Betty is asking in terms of how do we make them relatable? It's energy issues. Energy is important for development. Energy is important. For example, you're, Jero, I'm thinking you're in Nairobi. Think about communities like cities. You need like energy actually basically, and one of the things that have become KPLC has been trending for a couple of days nowadays now because of the whole issue of energy becoming too expensive, and not just in the cities but also in the rural areas. So you have to look into the money, how much money, how if you're doing an energy story, for example, you look into, and on average, how much is a standard home spending in the city in Nairobi, like for energy? How much are you consuming? The energy consumption, has it gone high? Energy, how much of money are you spending every single day, every month in terms of energy for that? And also, like, you can look in the rural areas, tariffs, have they gone high and stuff like that? So are people affording? Is it becoming more expensive? We look into businesses in terms of how much money are businesses spending in terms of that energy, and look into also what happens when our dams fill up, or when we have flooding, or when we have less water and probably we have rationing, energy cuts, and to what extent is that in interrupting businesses and stuff like that. You look into hospitals and different other areas, industries that this particular need energy. You can frame an energy story from that particular perspective. Financing, how much is it becoming too expensive? Or also look into the rural areas, how many people do not have, in terms of not having access to energy, probably because of too much interruptions. And also you can look into when it comes to government in terms of the infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, Kenya, for example, loses about 20% of our energy because of poor infrastructure. Like if you're connected to the grid, to what extent the nation carried a story just the other day that KPLC is complaining in terms because their customers are switching to solar. So those are some of it's humanizing those particular stories. To what extent are people, industries, and different others' perspective are being affected? You have to, when you're talking about climate stories, be it water, be it energy, be it cities, we have to learn to humanize those particular, put faces, effect, what is affecting, what is affecting industries, what is affecting communities, humanizing and putting human perspective, human faces into our stories. And that way we able to actually, our editors will be able to listen probably more in terms of whenever we are actually pitching these particular stories. But essentially is humanizing these particular stories. In regard to Tunisia, in terms of loss and damage and finance and stuff, it's the same. Look into, but I think when it comes to like this, I'll give examples that will actually probably help you in terms of the UNFCCC tomorrow. And that will actually help you in terms of understand how do you frame these particular stories in regard to how do you manage to report these particular high issues of loss and damage and also into finance in your day-to-day reporting.
Mm. And thank you, Sophie. It's also worth remembering, each one of us is learning and skilled in the different forms of journalism. So for instance, you have a hard news story, you have a human interest feature story, you have analysis and opinion. These are all very different styles of writing, and they are appropriate to different sections in your newspaper or in your broadcast context, and they are appropriate to different audiences. So it's worth remembering that you need to think through the process with each individual story. So for instance, if your story is corruption busting around energy decision making, that is going to be a hard news investigative piece with a very strong news angle, which might be quite different to, say, a human interest story where you tell the personal story of one person living within a context who is trying to manage their own energy needs within an energy uncertain environment. Or you might be writing an opinion piece where you're being reflective of what the general situation is around your community or your government's energy situation. So there's no one sort of silver bullet or one single answer for that question. You need to be aware of what your angle is, which is the most appropriate way for telling that story, and whether you want to use a hard news sort of very clinical surgical approach, or whether you want to put a human face onto it. Okay, so we are going to start wrapping up now. I'm going to give you just very quickly an overview of what the next process is. What we would like to do is, because I think often the best learning from these processes is to actually implement what we're learning. So the idea is we would like each of you to think through some of the science that you've heard today, think through some of the journalistic angles and ideas that we've discussed, and ahead of tomorrow's workshop, we would like you to identify a story that you would like to work on, the kind of story that you would pitch to your own editor, something that connects the global science with your local context. It could be anything, energy related, politics, development, health, urban infrastructure, agriculture. It could be to do with security and political stability. Think about what your angle would be, and imagine that you are going into your sort of daily news meeting with your editorial team tomorrow, and you've got 2 minutes to pitch the story. What do you think the angle is, and who do you think your main sources would be? Now, how we would like you to submit the pitch is using your smartphone. Just send us a short 2-minute pitch. You will send it to the WhatsApp group. And then tomorrow, and over the course of tomorrow and Wednesday, we will go through those. We will play those pitches to the whole group so that we can all listen to it And then Sophie and myself will give some ideas about, you know, how you can find the best sources, etc., other things that you might want to consider. So we're going to give everyone an opportunity to present a pitch. And what we would also like to do is take the 6 strongest pitches and give you the opportunity, invite you to, after this workshop process is finished, to work with myself and Sophie in expanding those even further. That's an invitation for you. All right, so we're going to wrap up now with a short photo session. But just a reminder, if you could all be online again tomorrow morning at the same time for an hour-and-a-half session. We're going to go through a little bit more science tomorrow, a little bit more regional impacts, and then we're going to have a few opportunities to talk about where to find the most important and likely sources for some of the information that we need in order to cover these stories in future.